next speaker, Dr. Daniel Gullifor, is an assistant professor of management and leadership and the Tyler Patterson Early Career Fellow in the College of Business here at UW-Eau Claire. He received his PhD from Texas Tech University and both his Bachelor of Science and Master of Business Administration from Bradley University. His research focuses on the imposter phenomenon, leadership, and core self-evaluations, and has been published in a variety of well-respected outlets, including the Journal of Management, the Journal of Organizational Behavior, and Leadership Quarterly. He has taught both graduate and undergraduate level courses in leadership and organizational behavior. And prior to entering academia, he worked in industry for several years in both human resource management and sales. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Gullifor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the College of Business and to ORSP as well. Today, what I'm going to do is give you a presentation for a paper that me and my colleagues have been working on called Avoiding Detection at All Costs, Examining the Dark Side of the Imposter Phenomenon in Organizations. And so I want to ask you all, has anybody ever experienced any of these thoughts before? So some of these things include, I can give the impression that I'm more competent than I really am. Things like, I rarely do a project as well as I'd like to do it. I avoid evaluations if possible and have dread of others evaluating me. Yeah, all right, you're not alone in those experiences. Our research actually shows that approximately 70% of people will experience these battles with the imposter phenomenon, or more popularized in popular industry and popular press as the imposter syndrome, are going to experience this at some point in their lives. These are actually items pulled directly off of the imposter phenomenon scale. So what do I mean when I say the imposter phenomenon? Well, I'm defining it as this experience of intellectual fraudulence and fear of exposure, whereby individuals think that they've fooled others into thinking that they're more competent than they think themselves to be, despite clear evidence of their competency. And so this was originally identified in clinical psychology among high-achieving women in academia. And what they found was that despite exemplary records of publications, course evaluations, promotion and tenure, fellowships, the whole thing, they never actually internalized their success and attribute it to themselves. They always said something to the effect of, I was just lucky. I had a great advisor. That project was going to be published no matter who was running it, right? And they always externalized this, and they feared that because none of this was because of them, eventually their luck was going to run out and they were going to be outed essentially as this imposter. Some people going so far as to think they're going to take away your job and all your accomplishments and all your awards. And then some people are thinking there maybe was a failure in the admission process and all those types of things, okay? Now, this is something that's been around since the late 70s, but it's only really started to take shape in a lot of other fields, including management, within the last 10 or 15 years, really. And so, consistent with the big seminal book here from Pauline Clance titled The Imposter Phenomenon, Overcoming the Fear That Haunts Our Success, most of the research has kind of looked at this research through the lens of this individual being haunted by this, that they fear the exposure, and as such, it evokes a sense of kind of pity or compassion and the assumption that these individuals are these benevolent actors that, oh, we just want them to enjoy their success, right? But nobody's actually looked at some of the things that maybe they're willing to do to avoid that potential exposure. That we've seen that there are some initial studies that have linked it to darker constructs like narcissism. We've seen that there's actually some silver lining to the experience, that individuals that experience imposterism are actually very interpersonally skilled. And so they're very adept in managing impressions and picking up on social cues and things like that so they can avoid that potential discovery. And so the question is, to what length are these individuals who experience IP willing to go to avoid being discovered? How destructive will they be? And then we also want to consider what's the role that leadership might play in either exacerbating or mitigating that. So what we want to do is we decided to take a look at 3 different constructs. We looked at coworker social undermining, envy, and abusive supervision to be able to help answer these questions, with undermining essentially being, how do we hinder others' ability to be effective in the workplace? How do we cut them down when we have the opportunity to? Envy, what's that negative affect experience when we look at somebody as having something that we really deeply want, but we don't possess, right? That experience of envy. And then what happens when you have a more abusive supervisor, somebody who is engaging in some of these hostile leadership behaviors, pitting employees against one another, tearing people down in public, really kind of creating that really toxic environment. And so to help us kind of understand the relationship between these contexts, I want to take a look at two things. The first is the actual definition of IP. So the actual definition of IP is really just this idea that it's a unique form of a self-concept discrepancy. So we have two forms of self-concepts. I'll use myself here as an example. So my own self-concept is what I think of myself, as particularly relates to my competency. The other self-concept is what I think you think of me. And essentially what we have is, as those self-concepts become disparate and they decouple in a manner where the other self-concept is more competent than our own self-concept, we experience IP. And so the further apart these get, the more intense the experience of IP becomes. All right. So we have these two self-concepts that are really driving this experience. And then the second aspect of the definition here is there's this fear of exposure. We know that our feelings can drive our behaviors and cause us to do things we wouldn't rationally do. And so when we talk about envy, that's one of those affective things that kind of can drive us into engaging in really harmful behaviors. So to help us explain how IP is related to these other things, we're going to draw upon ego depletion theory. So ego depletion theory is a theory that basically says that every individual has some finite pool of personal resources, and that every volitional action that we take to regulate ourselves, whether it be our thoughts, our emotions and affect, the behaviors we take, it is going to deplete that pool of resources, putting us into a state of depletion. And in that state of depletion, we are less equipped to handle whatever comes in the future, particularly things like managing that self-concept discrepancy. All right. And so here is our model. Now, because we have some time constraints, I'm not going to go into all of the nuanced discussions of, this is just 6 and we have a whole second study to do. Okay. But what we're saying here is that IP, essentially, because we're talking about that other self-concept and our own self-concept, what we want to do usually is we want to shrink that discrepancy. And one of the ways that we can do that is we tear down those around us, because if they are our peers, our coworkers, our assessment of our other self-concept is inherently tied to our peers. If they have some degree of competence and some ability and some demonstration of performance, everybody must think we must have some degree of that too, by extension. And so what we can do is, if we cut down other people, we essentially can bring that other self-concept down indirectly. All right. So we expect a positive relationship here. Somewhat related to this is the relationship between imposter phenomenon and envy. So again, we recognize that somebody has something that we want. In this particular experience, we see other people demonstrating their competence. We see they make it look so easy, right? It's so easy for them. I have to work hard. I have to get lucky, right? And so we experience this envy of other people who just seem to effortlessly float through organizational life, getting promotions and performance evaluations. Then this relationship here between envy and coworker undermining, this has actually been fleshed out in the literature already. There's very much so a strong relationship between we envy others, we're going to cut them down. So that's already there. And then we also want to take a look at abusive supervision. And we're saying if a boss is willing to engage in verbal abuse and pit people against each other, it's going to really exacerbate these relationships here. So we see that we have a moderated mediation model here that's kind of comprised here, right? Now, to test this, we went to Amazon's Mechanical Turk. We collected data across 3 different time samples, time waves here, with a minimum of 2 weeks across between each. The average was actually closer to about 3 weeks, but no less than 2. And we ended up with a final match sample of 119 participants. We utilized scales that have been validated in previous studies and are generally accepted, but we did, of course, do our own due diligence to validate them in our own study. And IP and abusive supervision was collected at time 1, envy at time 2, and coworker undermining at time 3 to make sure we have that temporal separation. We see that there's generally accepted reliabilities as well. We utilized, M+ to be able to run these analyses here. And what we see here is that all of these hold up and they are all supported with the exception of the direct relationship between IP and coworker undermining. That it isn't enough for just people to experience imposterism and then go and undermine people, that there are some intervening mechanisms that explain that. And particularly, it is envy. So we see the direct relationships here. We see this is the mediation right here, where we see the 95% confidence interval here, where 0 is not included. So we see that there's support for that. We see that there is a significant interaction term here. When we take a look at the margins plot, what we see is that for people that have high levels of IP under higher levels of abusive supervision, you're more likely to experience envy. And this is our conditional indirect effect as well. So we see that that index is also one that is going to be supported. So if we take a look, everything's supported with the exception of that one relationship. Now, there are some limitations of study one, and the first being we rely on ego depletion to make these relationships and hypotheses, but we don't directly test it. So we need to make sure that we're doing that to show that this is truly the mechanism that is actually driving these relationships. Secondly, we rely solely on an MTurk sample, and what we'd really want to see is maybe an example of working professionals in organizations and not people maybe sitting at home taking these surveys. And so we wanted to make sure that we're able to increase our external validity and generalizability of our findings. So we do this again, and we're going to make a nice simple hypothesis where essentially we're saying ego depletion is going to mediate this IP envy undermining relationship. And so just to kind of walk through it, we have this discrepancy. It's going to be a depleting experience. If we're envious of others, it's a depleting experience. To constantly be feeling envious of others, to constantly have to worry about managing impressions and how we're feeling. And it's going to drain those resources that we have. And it's through that that we actually ultimately get to undermining. So here's what our next model actually looks like. So we have ego depletion as a central mediator through this. Okay? So to do this one, we engage in a snowball sampling technique where we recruited undergraduate students in mid-level management courses at a public university in the upper Midwest, right? To be able to recruit individuals who are working full-time to take these surveys across 3 time periods. So they sent me the first author, the individual, their individual's email address, and then I sent this directly to them at 3 different times, time 1, time 2, time 3, with the average time being about 26 and 24 days between time 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 respectively, with the minimum of 3 between each. Had a sample of 198 participants. Again, we use the same surveys here, except for ego depletion. This one got dropped in at time 2 as well. That's at the same time as envy as well. And again, we have the same demonstration of reliability across all of these items. And here are our results. What we see is all of our direct relationships are also supported here. And then if we take a look at the bootstrapping and the confidence intervals, the bias-corrected confidence intervals here, we see that if we look at just this relationship here, just IP to depletion to undermining, we see it's supported. If we take a look at IP to envy to depletion to undermining, we also see it's supported. So we see that it is in fact depletion that is actually serving as this intervening mechanism to explain why individuals that have these bouts of this intellectual fraudulence and fear of exposure are willing to go after their coworkers and cut them down in the workplace, okay? So again, we see that this is supported. So revisiting the research question, what do we find out? Well, they're gonna go to very destructive lengths, right? Fear is a big motivator, and the fear of exposure is the ultimate pinnacle of the IP experience, and you will do anything to avoid being outed as an imposter. What role does leadership play? Well, we know that it can exacerbate the relationship. We know that it's one that if you have a leader who is not concerned about shrinking that discrepancy, you have a leader who's more concerned about getting, competition, unhealthy competition in the workplace, it's going to make it a lot worse. And by extension, you're going to end up with people undermining each other in the workplace. So what are our contributions? Well, we take an alternative, darker perspective of IP, thinking about how they aren't just necessarily benevolent actors that, we just wish they could, enjoy their success, but they're actually willing to engage in some malevolent behaviors to take care, to make themselves look better. We also produced some of the first empirical work linking IP to leadership research. There's a lot of good conceptual pieces out there that are kind of going there, but less so is done until this paper. And then we contribute to the expanding nomological network. So by taking this different perspective, IP has never been linked to envy, undermining, abusive supervision. None of these things have ever been connected. So we're among the first to really kind of take a look and really sink our teeth into that. Limitations, all self-report data. Now, we've done a lot of things that were very, we take care to make sure the data is high quality, and we think there's a reason why you measure certain things from the self perspective, particularly your own internal battle of fraudulence. But when we talk about other things like behaviors, maybe we can take a look at more observational based data, other, more innovative measures to be able to capture this, so we're not relying solely on scales. Which leads us into scale-based measurement, right? So we can talk about how it is that maybe we have, supervisors or even the coworkers that you're undermining rating. How much of these behaviors are you actually engaging in? Because we know we have implicit biases that, we don't think that we're that unethical. And so maybe we're actually undermining people and we don't even want to admit it. So, so there's a lot of things here that there's still a lot that we can kind of flesh out here in future research as well. And that's what I've got. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes.
So suppose you had a leader who cared about the interpersonal communications and how everybody gets along and supportiveness.
Yep.
Would you be better and traditional, you know better than I with your HR background, right? Traditional mechanisms are to stop undermining your coworkers, right?
Yep.
Is to focus on that behavior. But if in fact the root cause of that is the imposter phenomenon, do you have suggestions and strategies in general that leaders can use to try to make things better in the workplace?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to repeat the question here for our listeners here on the video. So if we're talking about imposterism, how essentially can leaders kind of get involved to make sure that they're mitigating some of these things, even though it's a very internalized experience to the individual? Did I capture that?
That works. Because typically they focus on the behavior, not what's causing the person to behave in a way that we don't want them to behave. Yeah, right?
Absolutely, right? And so for me, it all comes back to this idea about this discrepancy. So when we talk about these self-concepts, our self-concepts have these, both stable and malleable elements, meaning that we have a general idea of where we're at, and we carry that with us across time and across situations. But when we find ourselves in situations where the leader is more involved, or we find ourselves in a more political environment, or whatever it may be, that there is responsiveness to those situations, right? The experience of IP, I'll tell you firsthand, it's much higher for me right now than it is if I was just brushing my teeth this morning, right? I'm standing up there in front of peers with, bosses and all these things, right? And so, so there is a way to help with that. And essentially, over a period of time with more consistent exposure, there is a way to diminish the IP experience. So there's a recent article that just came out in the last couple of months here that kind of did a scoping review of what are the interventions that you can do to help mitigate that. And they all kind of come in different forms, but really it boils down to two different ways to approach it. And that is establishing peer groups. So essentially, you're not the only one experiencing this, right? That's kind of why I had you all raise your hand, right? We're all in this together, right? We've all had these bouts, okay? And the second is coaching. So the coaching is very much so the idea of shrinking that discrepancy, and that'll come in a couple of different ways, right? So in terms of our own self-concept, usually that's more of the individual's issue with constantly throwing out whatever positive feedback they get, right? But this other self-concept, they have a little bit more active role they can play in that as well. So if they're able to consistently say these things, consistently support, you should see these things start to kind of come back together a little bit. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
That's theory, but others, yeah.
I'm fascinated by the ego depletion.
Mhm.
And I know you showed us one item that says something like I'm exhausted or
I feel drained.
I feel drained.
Yeah, right now I feel drained. Yep.
So just a couple of quick questions, like, do you remember a few other items so we can understand this a little bit better?
Mhm.
And also, like, do you see burnout is a part of this, or burnout is a different thing?
Very much so related, very much so related. And so some of the other items from that scale included things like going directly to say things like, I feel really depleted right now. Things like, I don't feel like I'm at my best right now. So it's very much so related to burnout. Burnout is a little bit more all-encompassing, where ego depletion is more about how it is that we control and our self-presentation and self-regulation. Burnout can come in a lot, kind of some broader senses, and where you can consider more contextual things and focus more on burnout in the workplace. But when we're talking about ego depletion, we're talking about self-regulatory resources. So we're talking about, how do I maintain this discrepancy? How do I reconcile this in my head, right? So very, if we want to go all the way back to like Fessinger and think about like cognitive dissonance, right? And the idea that it creates this unpleasant experience, and that's a draining thing. Envy, we have these emotions that we have, this emotional regulation, the emotional labor that comes with it. That's a draining thing. Talking about how it is that we engage in impression management to make sure that we're putting ourselves in scenarios where we are not going to be discovered, and people have that high sense of concern, think of us in a higher manner. All of that is draining ourselves in terms of our ego depletion. Does that lead to burnout? Yes, but they're very much so related, but they are a little distinct as well.
So that's all the time we have for today. So let's thank our speakers.